Hello, welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. Today, I invite Ben Rogers, founder of Hong Kong Watch and human rights activist, to comment on Hong Kong and Huawei. Hello, Ben.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And let's talk about Hong Kong first. Today, the 26th May, Beijing unexpectedly amended the proposed national security law for Hong Kong by expanding its scope to prohibit so-called activities that would seriously endanger national security. What is your comment?
My comment is that this is an extreme overreaction by Beijing, but it's also a grave danger to Hong Kong's most basic freedoms. When the National People's Congress announced last week that it was going to impose a national security law on Hong Kong, it seemed to me there were two things. Firstly, it was an attack on Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy. It was the destruction of one country, two systems, but also a grave breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and therefore an assault on the international rules-based order, because as a signatory to an international treaty, which is lodged at the United Nations, to completely breach its promises under that treaty shows a total disrespect for the international rules-based order. So those were my thoughts when the announcement was first made a week ago. Now, with this announcement that it would be further expanded, I think that is even more alarming. And it calls into question, what will that mean for people on the ground? For example, I myself was denied entry to Hong Kong in 2017. Presumably, I have absolutely no chance now of ever going to Hong Kong again once this law is in place. I didn't think it was likely I'd be able to anyway, but this law will make that an impossibility. But much more seriously, what will be the dangers for people in Hong Kong in communicating with someone like me? If they engage with Hong Kong Watch, if they share information, if they tweet things that I've written, will that be an offence? If they engage with foreign parliamentarians, as they often do, by giving evidence of what's happening in Hong Kong, or with foreign media, what will be the implications for that? What will be the effect on religious freedom in Hong Kong? I don't think necessarily that churches and places of worship will be closed, but I think it's certainly a possibility that Chinese Communist Party agents will be monitoring, as they do in mainland China, the sermons of religious leaders, and if a religious leader preaches on values of justice and human rights, what will be the impact for them? Press freedom is going to be severely constrained as well, and the list goes on. This is a total all-out assault on Hong Kong's freedoms, human rights and way of life, and it will mean the end of not just one country, two systems, but the end of Hong Kong as we know it if this goes through. And so the international community must speak up and do everything it possibly can to try, if possible, to prevent this going through.
So also Beijing makes another move in terms of excludes foreign judges from sitting in so-called national security cases. So what do you think of it?
I think that's also appalling. I mean, every country has a right and a responsibility to protect national security, of course, but the Chinese Communist Party's definition of national security is totally different from most open societies' definition. They regard political dissent, criticism, any form of opposition to be a threat to national security, I think, and to impose this law, especially without delivering on the other aspects of Hong Kong's basic law, such as the promise for universal suffrage, and without providing safeguards for basic human rights, is appalling. And to say that foreign judges who've been invited ever since the handover to sit in Hong Kong's highest court, that they may not sit in such cases that relate under this law, I think is really an attack not just on freedom but on the rule of law and on the independence of the judiciary. And I presume the next step is very likely to be trying to stack the highest courts with pro-Beijing judges and therefore undermine possibly the one thing that is left in Hong Kong, albeit in a very fragile form, and that is the independence of the judiciary.
Yeah, actually, according to the basic law, which is the mini constitutions of Hong Kong, the national security law is basically the jurisdiction of Hong Kong, right? Rather than the National People's Congress of the PRC.
That's exactly right. And so not only is the law itself deeply, deeply dangerous and alarming, but the way that Beijing has gone about this is an all-out undermining and disregard for Hong Kong's autonomy. The basic law does require that Article 23, the national security legislation, be introduced in Hong Kong. And if you remember, when it was previously tried back in 2003, it provoked huge demonstrations against it in Hong Kong, and the government at that time backed down and didn't go forward with it. Sooner or later, because the basic law requires it, we knew that this legislation would come up. But firstly, it should have come up after promises to deliver universal suffrage had been fulfilled, and where basic rights and freedoms were absolutely enshrined and guaranteed. And then you can have measures to genuinely protect against real national security risks. That's entirely legitimate. But all of that should have happened through the Hong Kong legislature, the Legislative Council. And the way Beijing has done it is to announce it from Beijing, from the National People's Congress, imposing it completely top-down on Hong Kong. And if it goes through LegCo after the NPC, then that's just a sham sort of show and a rubber stamp. It's not going to be any meaningful legislative process. And so Hong Kong's autonomy is now destroyed, and the Hong Kong government has been absolutely complicit with that, and they are nothing more than the Chinese Communist Party's puppets in destroying Hong Kong.
And this national security law is scheduled to be passed at the National Congress meeting this Thursday. Yeah, and so how different? Yeah, it caused, of course, a protest in Hong Kong last Sunday. So how different was the protest last Sunday from those late last year?
Well, from everything that I could see through the media reports and social media, it was similar to to the vast majority of the protests last year, in that from the protesters' side, my understanding was that it was totally peaceful. Of course, late last year, there were protests where a small minority of people did engage in acts of violence, although I don't condone those acts of violence that we saw late last year, although I would say that they were almost always in response to police brutality, and that it was the police that provoked the violence. But nevertheless, what we saw on Sunday was more an echo of the protests that we saw last summer against the extradition bill, where thousands of people turned out very courageously, totally peacefully, with great discipline. And once again, the police acted with indiscriminate force, firing tear gas and pepper spray, and acting with impunity. So it was more of the same of what we'd seen for the most part last year. And what it says to me, I think, is that the Hong Kong people are definitely not going to take this lying down. They're not just going to roll over. And I think we will see more protests. I've heard that there may be protests in Hong Kong tomorrow. And I would simply encourage Hong Kongers to hold with that spirit of determination but non-violence, because when they are non-violent and determined but protesting in large numbers, they win the hearts of the world, and the world will speak out and act much more. It was Lord Alton, a patron of Hong Kong Watch, in an interview with me that went out yesterday, through Hong Kong Watch's YouTube channel,
Yeah.
and he said to Hong Kongers, don't respond to your enemy with the kind of behaviour that they use. So don't respond to the police with violence. Hold your moral high ground. But I'm sure that when they do that, the protests will continue. Although I fear that the police and the Chinese Communist Party's reaction will be increasingly violent, tragically.
So the CCP Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman said yesterday that along with the handover of the sovereignty of Hong Kong back to China, the UK has completed its rights and obligations to Hong Kong. So what do you think?
He's talking total nonsense. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a legally valid, internationally binding treaty lodged at the United Nations, valid for the first 50 years after the handover, so from 1997 until 2047. And Britain has responsibilities under that treaty to monitor and ensure that the promises made to the people of Hong Kong are delivered, at least for the first 50 years from the handover. Of course, we don't have power in Hong Kong. Nobody's suggesting that we do, but we do have responsibilities under that treaty to ensure that the promises to Hong Kong under that treaty are delivered on and are kept. And I think Britain should be speaking up even more than it has. And the Chinese, the CCP spokesman is completely wrong.
How has the UK government responded so far to this Beijing's move, and what else can it do?
Well, last week, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab did issue a statement jointly with his Canadian and Australian counterparts, expressing grave concern at the announcement of the national security law and the implications for one country, two systems. And I very much welcome that. And it's not, I know some people think Britain has done nothing, and that people ask the question, where is Britain? I don't think that's entirely fair. And I know from my conversations with the British government that there's a lot of concern and a lot of, I think, work behind the scenes. My concern with the British government's approach, though, is that it has been too much behind the scenes and too slow. And I think it needs to be much more robust in public, much more rapid in its response, and to really look at concrete things that it can do. And so there are a number of things I propose for the British government. First and foremost, it should be speaking out, as I say, much more robustly, much more clearly in public, and much more consistently, so that above all else, both Hong Kong people know that Britain is there for them and Britain is living up to its obligations under the joint declaration, and also so that the rest of the international community know that Britain is prepared to lead the cause in defending Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms. The second thing I think Britain should do is to form an international contact group of like-minded countries to coordinate a response to the crisis that is underway in Hong Kong. And one reason for doing that is that the British government often says to me, we can't do this on our own. And at the same time, other governments that I talk to say, we're willing to help, but where is Britain? We want Britain to lead. Britain has the particular responsibility. And both of those, I think, are valid points. And so let's put them together and form an international contact group that brings together, for example, the UK, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, our allies across Europe, but also democratic countries in the Asia-Pacific region like Japan and South Korea, and possibly some Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, to formulate a truly global coordinated response. The third thing I think the UK should do, and other countries should also do, is to look at imposing Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions on officials both in the central government in Beijing and the Hong Kong government who are responsible directly or indirectly for serious violations of human rights and right now for breaches of the Joint Declaration. I think Britain should also be looking at how we can expand protection for British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong, be it BNOs, to whom we have a specific responsibility, but who don't currently have the right of abode in the UK. We should be looking at how we can better protect them, but also together with other countries, what can we do to offer protection to young, vulnerable, frontline political activists in Hong Kong who aren't BNOs, but who will be in grave danger under this national security law? Can we, together with other countries, maybe through the Commonwealth, maybe with others, offer a package of immigration and asylum protection for those who need it? Should that be needed? I mean, I don't want to encourage Hong Kong people to leave Hong Kong. I want them to be able to stay there, but I think we should be thinking of how we can better protect them in case they need to get out. There are other things we should also be doing. For example, as the situation escalates and becomes more tense, and as we approach, of course, now the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, we should be doing everything we possibly can to prevent the occurrence of a Tiananmen 2 in Hong Kong. I really, like all of us, sincerely hope that never happens, but we should be doing what we can to prevent that by, for example, having some kind of international human rights and humanitarian observation mission on the ground in Hong Kong to make sure that, as far as possible, that the Chinese Communist Party authorities do not crack down in that kind of horrifically brutal way. It's no good waiting until there's bloodshed on the streets. We should be doing what we can to prevent that. So those are a few of the things I think we should do. I've lost count of how many I gave there, but I have been saying to people that just as Hong Kong protesters had their slogan, 5 demands and not one less, I have 5 recommendations to the international community, 5 recommendations and not one less. I may have gone over 5 in that list, but those are some things Britain and others could do.
We all know that Lord Chris Patten, the last British governor to Hong Kong, led some parliamentaries and politicians of various countries, made a joint statement. Could you tell us more about it?
Yes, I think it's the most significant statement I have ever seen in more than 20 years of human rights advocacy and activism. It's a statement that, as you say, was led by Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, together with the former Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind. It's been signed by 2 other former British Foreign Secretaries, David Miliband and Jack Straw. It's been signed by 3 former Defence Secretaries, 2 former Speakers of the House of Commons, many other senior parliamentarians and former ministers in the UK. Some of the most senior members of the United States Congress, including Senator Marco Rubio, Congressman Chris Smith, but also the chairs of some of the most important committees in Congress, like the Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Elliot Engel and the Armed Services Committee Chair and other committee chairs, and then also by many parliamentarians and politicians from, I believe it's now up to 30 countries. I think the signatories now are around 280 people from 30 countries, and they include Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, many European countries, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Slovakia, Lithuania, and many others, Ukraine, the former foreign ministers of a number of countries, the former foreign minister of the Maldives, the former foreign minister of Poland and Estonia, the former prime ministers of Lithuania and Belgium, and parliamentarians also in the Asia-Pacific region, in Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Malaysia. So it is truly a global statement. And the thing that I think is particularly significant is that it is totally and very broadly bipartisan. So there are politicians who are conservatives, who are socialists, who are liberals, who are Greens, who are independents. And for example, I mean, I never expected to see signing on to the same letter somebody like Guy Verhofstadt, the former Prime Minister of Belgium, who is a member of the European Parliament and who is a very vocal critic of the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. But he's signed on together with people like the former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith and the former Defence Secretary Liam Fox, who are two of the most prominent Brexiteers in the UK. We've got leaders of Green parties around the world, and Republicans and Democrats in the United States, all of the Liberal Democrats members of Parliament in the UK. So truly cross-party, truly bipartisan, and truly international. And I think it sends a very clear message that the world cares about Hong Kong, that the world is watching, and that not just watching, but we need action. And I hope that message is a source of some strength and encouragement to people in Hong Kong, and also a warning that might give the CCP and the Hong Kong government some pause for thought.
We have seen strong condemnations of Beijing's move issued by American politicians and lawmakers. Do you think this time the Americans will take substantial actions or simply issue words again?
Well, I think definitely everyone should take action. Words are important because silence is even worse, and evil flourishes when there's silence. So words are important. Statements are important, both in encouraging people in Hong Kong and, more importantly, in mobilizing the world and awakening the world. But of course, words are not enough, and by themselves they're of limited value. So yes, I hope the US will take action. I have never been enthusiastic about the idea of the United States revoking the special status that it gives Hong Kong for trade. Special status under the legislation for Hong Kong in the US Congress that sees a distinction between Hong Kong and the rest of mainland China and gives trade preferences to Hong Kong. That legislation is there because of one country, two systems, because Hong Kong is supposed to be a special administrative region of the PRC, but one with a high degree of autonomy. And the phrase that was used at the time of the handover was Hong Kong people running Hong Kong. I never want to see that special status removed, because it would have potentially very damaging consequences economically for businesses and jobs and people in Hong Kong. But I think it has to be on the table, because that special status is only there as long as Hong Kong's autonomy is there. And if Hong Kong's autonomy is stripped away, as it clearly is now, and clearly Hong Kong people are not running Hong Kong. I mean, that phrase is a joke, but the Hong Kong government may be by birth Hong Kong people, but they're Beijing's puppets. They're the CCP puppets doing the CCP's dirty work. So Hong Kong people are not running Hong Kong, and one has to ask the question: why should Hong Kong, if it goes down that path, have the special status? So that may be one option for the US. I think there is also already provision in the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act for Magnitsky-style targeted sanctions against individual officials in the CCP regime and the Hong Kong government. Those should be implemented, and the US should look at other ways that it can work together with allies. I think it's really important that the international community works together as one. But yes, I hope the US will respond with more than words.
The mainstream media in the US and the UK generally have had very limited coverage of the Hong Kong issues. Why is that, according to you?
Well, probably the major reason is that the whole world is engulfed in this COVID-19 pandemic, which, let's not forget, originated in China and originated because of the Chinese Communist Party's repression of truth. And its failure to alert the world, indeed its silencing of the whistleblowers, and it is a symptom of the Chinese Communist Party's repression and mendacity. And so the world is engulfed with this pandemic that is threatening lives, has killed many lives already, that is having dire social consequences and desperate economic consequences, millions of jobs lost, millions of people unemployed. And so the world is focused on that. And the tragedy is, I think, that the CCP has chosen its timing very deliberately in the hope that it can get all this through with the rest of the world not having either the attention to it or indeed the capacity to deal with it, because we're dealing with a pandemic with all the public health and economic and social consequences that entails. I hope the international community will prove the CCP wrong and show that actually we can multitask, and that just as we're dealing with the global crisis of the pandemic, what is happening in Hong Kong threatens to be a crisis of freedom that should be just as much a concern for the world as the pandemic, because Hong Kong is a vital international financial center. It's the new front line in the fight for freedom. It has been one of Asia's most open cities. And so I hope that the media and politicians will wake up. And there are some signs that they are starting to. The fact that we have 280 politicians from 30 countries signing on to this statement is a sign of that. But definitely it needs more attention. And I hope that the reasons I've given in answer to your question, that the media and politicians are focused on the pandemic, I hope that it will prove possible to continue to work on dealing with COVID-19 and give Hong Kong the attention it needs.
I noticed in the past 2 days, many Hong Kong youngsters begin actively using Twitter. If any, what advice would you like to give them?
Well, I would say certainly engage through social media, through Twitter or other forms of social media with the rest of the world. Make your voice heard. Maybe tweet politicians around the world who haven't yet signed on to the statement that Lord Patten and Sir Malcolm Rifkind have initiated. If there are politicians that you know of, or not just politicians, but celebrities, public figures, people, prominent experts around the world, tweet them and bring the statement to their attention and ask them if they would join with it. I think Hong Kong has a window of maybe even just a few weeks where they still can use Twitter, and I hope that they will do so in a way that will truly make their voice heard to the world. But I also caveat that by expressing my concern that I understand. I've already had people in Hong Kong contacting me saying they may have to clear their Twitter feeds, they may have to go off Twitter and social media, they may have to be on but anonymously or using a different name. And people are very understandably very frightened and very concerned, because once this law is in place, and the Hong Kong government has already talked about monitoring social media more closely and giving the police powers to do so, social media users in Hong Kong may be in some danger. So I don't underestimate the risks, and Hong Kongers know the risks better than I do, and they can navigate those risks. But for the time that you have this window of still some remaining freedom, I would say those who are brave enough to do so and creative enough to do so, and maybe doing so in ways that reduce the risks for themselves, but to use it to make your voice heard to the world.
What else would you like to say about Hong Kong?
I think I just want to say that I never expected the situation to escalate to the point that it is at now. I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover from 1997 to 2002. And when I left in 2002, one country, two systems was working pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well. And I thought Hong Kong's way of life, basic freedoms were broadly intact. And I never expected less than halfway through the 50 years of one country, two systems and of the Sino-British Joint Declaration that already those things would be threatened so much as they are. I mean, so much so that unless things change very dramatically for the better, we can say that one country, two systems and one country, two systems and Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms are dead, are over. And the Joint Declaration is not dead because it's still valid from our point of view, and we must keep pointing to that. And I want to say to Hong Kongers that I and my colleagues in Hong Kong Watch will not rest whilst this fight is going on. For the last several days, a team of several of us in Hong Kong Watch have been working pretty much night and day on this with a range of media interviews, op-eds, advocacy initiatives, gathering signatories for Lord Patton's statement, and we'll go on doing everything we possibly can to alert the world, because Hong Kong matters. This is not just the fight for Hong Kong's freedoms. This is the fight for freedom for all of us. And if Hong Kong is lost, then our own freedoms become more vulnerable. And so it's in all our interests to make sure that we do everything we can to save Hong Kong.